The Appeal, and now this. I'm your host, Jay Willis, and today we are discussing the science of climate change, although a healthy proportion of Republican politicians in this country would perhaps quibble with the existence of such a thing in the first place. The consensus in the scientific community is that climate change is real, that human activity is largely responsible for the climate change that we're seeing, and that failing to address it will make the problem worse. In most of the world, this is not especially controversial. Nearly 200 countries have signed on to the Paris Agreement, an international treaty intended to keep the increase in average global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, and ideally below 1.5 degrees. Yet here in the United States, the notion that a problem exists that merits policy change, much less international cooperation, is often the subject of bitter partisan rancor and debate. Generally speaking, the dispute breaks down between Democrats, who accept that scientific consensus, and Republicans, who express varying degrees of skepticism and various rationales for doing so. President Trump has previously referred to global warming as a con, a hoax, and as something that was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. In 2017, as you may remember, he initiated the process of withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement altogether. A greatest hits of Republican science denial anecdotes would require far more time than we have allotted here today, but among my personal favorites are Oklahoma Senator Jim Inhofe, who previously declared climate change, quote, the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, and who once brought a snowball on the Senate floor to, as I understand it, help make his point. Texas Senator John Cornyn, whose rejoinder to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's observation that July 2019 was the hottest month in history was, quote, it's summer, Chuck, end quote. And Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who has referred to climate change as the perfect pseudoscientific theory for a big government politician who wants more power. In a possibly related story, these senators represent states that are consistently among the top crude oil producers in the nation. Voters, by and large, feel differently. About 2/3 of them believe that the federal government isn't doing enough to reduce the effects of climate change, and close to the same amount believe that stricter environmental regulations are worth the associated financial costs. This may be related to the fact that now more than 60% of Americans say they've seen some effects of climate change in their own communities: hot weather, flooding, droughts, wildfires, and so on. Yet Republicans in Washington often appear incapable of responding either to this crisis or to the growing consensus that it required intervention, frankly, a long time ago. So here to discuss how we got to this point and how hopefully we might be able to get out of it is Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, the Senate sponsor of the Green New Deal resolution, and Professor Leah Stokes of UC Santa Barbara, who focuses on the politics and policy of climate change. Senator, Professor, thank you again for joining me today. And Senator Markey, I'll begin today's discussion with you. But before we get into the urgent topic at hand, I do want to ask you briefly about another urgent topic at hand. After the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you wrote that if Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell fills the Supreme Court vacancy before the next election, the next Senate Democratic majority must get rid of the filibuster and expand the court. As Republicans give every indication that they intend to do exactly that, what are you hearing from your Democratic colleagues about court expansion? What consensuses, what discussions are emerging around this issue?
Well, again, I put that out there immediately in order to make sure that Republicans would understand that there would be repercussions if they decided to, one, violate their pledge not to confirm a Supreme Court justice in a presidential election year, and to just move rapidly without full due consideration of a nominee to confirm them. So I just wanted to make it very clear to them that that would have led, at the conclusion of that process, to the Republicans stealing 2 Supreme Court justices, 2, going back to Merrick Garland's seat back in 2016. And I just wanted to make it very clear that from my perspective, we would just have to change the filibuster rules and begin a whole process next January of expanding the Supreme Court. Because if they're going to do it, we have to do it as Democrats, and we have a very good chance to win the United States Senate in 2020. So from my perspective, that's where we are. Now, many of my Democratic colleagues, they want to focus right now on this one nomination, which we should, and on explaining to the American public, not only as part of this confirmation process, but also heading into an election, which is now coming down to 5 weeks from now, what the consequences are in terms of, for example, the Affordable Care Act, pre-existing conditions, climate laws, LGBTQ protections, labor protections, and to focus on that for the short term, and to make sure that everyone understands that if there's a 6-3 Republican Supreme Court, it does put Roe versus Wade right in the crosshairs. So to a certain extent, what I was trying to do is just move ahead, make sure that everyone understood what the consequences were if the Republicans did this. And some agree with me. Others just want to focus right now on this nomination and on the election. But I just think that if they do it, it's going to be inevitable that the discussion we're going to have as Democrats in the majority is to change the rules, because the number of Supreme Court justices is not, in fact, in the United States Constitution. It's determined by the House and Senate. And I just think it's absolutely imperative that we do so if the Republicans act in this absolutely irresponsible way, driven by our criminally negligent, climate-denying president.
Obviously, both doing away with the legislative filibuster to expand the court and expanding the court itself, both of those would be significant acts. What sort of arguments are you making? How are you messaging the importance of this versus those who might dismiss it as radical? Who are going to be the holdouts on this debate? And what are their personal cell phone numbers?
What's radical? Okay, what's radical is stealing 2 Supreme Court justices. What's radical is having a nomination process that takes place in the aftermath of a solemn pledge by Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all the Republicans that they would never do such a thing. That's radical. This is a threat to our democracy, and it's the second time they've done it. So what we're doing, if they're successful, is just having a remedy, because it's not in the Constitution what the numbers of justices would be. And they would have fundamentally altered the Supreme Court for a generation if they are successful. And I just think we have to do everything we can then to put in place the countermeasure. And we'll reach that. We're going to reach that moment, I think, in the immediate aftermath of this election, especially if they're successful, and especially if Trump's strategy is to then take the election results to the Supreme Court with a 6-3 Republican margin and try to win it in the Supreme Court the same way they won it in 2000 in the Supreme Court. If we've got control over the United States Senate, that should be all we need to know about how we cannot allow this man having attempted to steal the presidency, and maybe successfully, if he can win 5-4 again in the Supreme Court. And we must put in place then the remedy. Otherwise, every climate law, LGBTQ, women's health, labor law will be on the table for repeal, for overturning in the court system over the next 4 years and beyond.
Thank you, Senator. I guess I'll circle back with you later on the personal cell phone numbers aspect of that question. Turning now to the subject of today, you represent Massachusetts, an environment in which people might think it's a little bit easier for a statewide political candidate to champion climate change legislation than it might be in, say, Oklahoma or Texas. I'm wondering, what role does climate change, and specifically the Green New Deal resolution that you've put forward, what role does that play in national politics? And what should candidates who support it in other states be saying on the campaign trail to reach out to voters who might be a little bit more skeptical?
I'm not saying we're going to win Oklahoma with the Green New Deal, but I am saying that in many other swing states, that the Green New Deal, that the climate crisis is going to be right on the front burner because it's happening, it's real, it's absolutely something that is jeopardizing the health and well-being of families, and that supporting strong climate policies is good politics. It's a job creator by the millions. It protects against the worst, most catastrophic consequences in those swing states of climate crisis. And in my opinion, it's moving big time in our direction. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are now employed in the clean energy sector that we did not have 6 or 8 years ago. So from my perspective, the polling says that 2/3 of all voters believe that comprehensive climate legislation should be a top priority in the next Congress, and we should be targeting it in the swing states. And we might not win Jim Inhofe and Oklahoma, but we can win electoral college votes in order to put those fundamental changes on the books.
Thank you, Senator. Professor, I want to turn to you because it's sort of accepted now that climate change is a partisan issue. But I do think it's important to, pardon the phrase, drill down a little bit on how it got to be that way. So your new book, Short-Circuiting Policy, explores some of the causes of this country's failure to address the climate crisis, and specifically the role of interest groups in the response effort. So at the risk of making you, give away the secret and sell fewer books, what did you conclude from there? How have corporate interests helped to facilitate this status quo?
Well, don't worry, academics do not make money selling books. That's not what we're in the business of. We're in the business of finding out facts and spreading ideas. So I'm happy to talk about my book. The fact is that just a few years ago, we had an ad made between Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi, and they were sitting on a couch in front of the Capitol, and they said, "We don't agree about many things, but one thing we do agree about is climate change." And when we think back to that ad, it's kind of shocking to find ourselves in the world that we are in today. And what I argue from my research is that what has happened is that fossil fuel companies, electric utilities, and other industries tied to fossil fuels have been running primary challengers against politicians in the Republican Party who are willing to act on climate change. And what that does is it sends a signal to those Republicans that they can't be on the wrong side, according to fossil fuel interests, of the climate change issue. And that leads to what we call asymmetric polarization. A lot of people think that polarization means that the Democrats and the Republicans are moving like this. That isn't true according to political science research. What's really happening is that the Democrats are staying about here and the Republicans are becoming an extremist party that is unfortunately captured by the fossil fuel industry. And so things like Citizens United have really affected the role that fossil fuels are playing in our democratic system and are driving polarization within the Republican Party.
Thanks. I do want to come back to that polarization issue that you talk about, because I certainly agree. It seems like this is only moving in one way. That's an intuitive way to I think an intuitive message to take away. And it's interesting to hear that the research obviously bears that out. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is due in part to at least the absence of sort of a comprehensive plan from the current administration, Republicans in power. We've seen a run lately of corporations maybe filling this vacuum or trying to appear to fill this vacuum by putting out climate plans of their own. Google, for example, says it will use 100% renewable energy at their facilities by 2030. And those are, big energy intensive tech facilities that take up a lot of resources. Why are corporations doing this? What's the point? Do they matter? What should we take away from it?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Google pledge because I actually think that the Google commitment is the most important corporate commitment we've seen so far. What Google specifically agreed to or said that they would do is have 100% clean electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to all their facilities. That's a lot better than the kinds of pledges that we've seen so far, which are just buying basically what we say the attributes of energy. We're saying we're going to buy a bunch of clean energy certificates and we're going to use that to match the amount of energy we consume. But that doesn't match it in real time. And if we really want to decarbonize our electricity system, which is what I focus on in my work, we need to decarbonize it in real time. So the Google commitment is a commitment to do that in real time for all their facilities. And as you've mentioned, Google is probably one of the #1 energy consumers in this country. So that's a very big commitment. What I would say is that Google should push itself to go farther and actually lobby Congress to take up comprehensive climate legislation. Because I was recently hearing a talk by Senator Whitehouse, and what he said is that too often these corporations make these commitments, but they never show up in Congress to lobby when, for example, Senator Markey has a Green New Deal, or when we have the Waxman-Markey bill, right? We need these corporations not just to make pledges, but to show up and support real comprehensive climate legislation in Congress. And I'll say one other thing. A lot of electric utilities, which is the industry I study, a lot of them have been making pledges to clean up their electricity supply. And I just want to caution against interpreting those pledges too strongly, because what we really need is state and, importantly, federal laws that require more clean electricity, not pledges that go out to 2050 and are not even binding on the decisions that these companies are making. Take, for example, Southern Company. This is a very polluting company that operates several subsidiary corporations, including Georgia Power and Alabama Power. They have these large coal plants that are really dirty, that pollute the air largely for Black communities, leading to asthma rates for Black children that are 2 times as high as white children. Those coal plants are also not economic, meaning if you were to shut them down tomorrow and replace them with a wind facility, it would save people money. Now, Southern has said, we're going to clean up our electricity system by 2050. First of all, that's not fast enough. And secondly, they have not required that their subsidiary companies, Alabama Power and Georgia Power, in their actual decision-making at the state level, that they make decisions in line with that pledge. So they're making a pledge, it's largely meaningless, it's not fast enough, and it's not actually being enforced at all. So we need laws. Most importantly, we need a federal clean electricity standard, which is exactly what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have committed to doing.
Thank you. I want to ask these questions of both of you. Senator Markey, I'll pose it to you first, but I'd love for both of your thoughts on this. So as I mentioned earlier, polling shows that among Republican politicians, the skepticism of the need for climate change legislation is out of touch with voters nationally. But again, we need a different idiom other than drilling down, huh? Drilling down by partisan affiliation, it gets a little more complicated. So 90% of Democrats say the government is doing too little to address climate change, but only 39% of Republican voters say the same. And we also see that although more Americans today say climate change is a major threat than they did 10 years ago, most of that increase is attributable to enthusiasm among Democrats. So Senator Markey, what role does political polarization, especially the type we see on TV in Washington, play in sort of the climate change discourse? And how do you make the case to voters who might be hearing something very different from the politicians closer to home who represent them? How do you reach them?
Well, again, as the professor was saying, ultimately this is not a question of science. The science is settled. So it's a question of politics. And the science is on our side, and we can see the results of the science every day. California fires, Washington State, Oregon. We can see what's happening in Louisiana. We can see what's happening in the Antarctic. We can see it, we can see it, we can see it. We can see the incredible windstorms coming through Iowa. All of this is the direct result of an intensification of climate and its impact upon our country. So to the extent to which it's becoming more clear and younger people really care about this issue, and we can also make the job creation case very strongly. It's all there for us now. We've gone from 2,000 megawatts of solar in in 2008 up to nearly 95,000 megawatts of solar. We've gone from 25,000 megawatts of wind up to 125,000 megawatts of wind. We've gone from only 2,000 all-electric vehicles. Say that again, 2,000 all-electric vehicles in our whole country. In 2008, we now have 1.5 million. And now Volkswagen, other companies, they're all having a competition who can produce the lowest cost all-electric vehicle, not just for here, but for around the world. So our theory is being borne out in terms of the economics of these issues, the jobs that are being created. That's going to impact suburban votes. We create more jobs, and we also reduce the danger, which increasingly they care about as voters. To the professor's point, back in 2007, I had been successful in moving over the spectrum so that Google could actually introduce the Android. So I was there celebrating its introduction, and Larry Page said, but I want to show you something else, even more important. So I went out into the Google parking lot with him, and he showed me all of the parking spaces reserved for all electric vehicles. So Google has been on this the whole way. And they're a shining example of what's happening, but we cannot just rely upon voluntary standards. We need to have a standard. We know you can meet it because Google's going to meet it. It's not as though we're asking people to do the impossible. We're only asking them to do what is already technologically feasible to do. And we just need a standard that says it's not going to be oppressive. In fact, you're going to save money in the long run because you're adopting these low-cost energy strategies. So all of this goes just to the politics of this issue. Young people really care about it. I saw it in my race here in 2020. We had thousands and thousands of young people who joined the campaign, who were energized by it, joining older climate activists in a powerful wave that we were able to build here. I think that same formula is true for many states around our country, many states. We shouldn't be shying away from it. We should be leaning into it. We should be thinking big. We should be saying, we have a big vision for job creation and justice, especially for frontline communities. If we do that, we're going to boost the turnout, and we're going to be successful in state after state. That's my message. This is what I just learned. And we defied, by the way, all the experts in Massachusetts who said I couldn't win this race. They were all wrong. And how did I do it? We energized people that actually cared about this issue. And they came out in unprecedented numbers. By the way, we broke the all-time Massachusetts record for turnout in a primary, any primary in American history, in Massachusetts history, rather, the all-time record. And here's our little secret. We built it around issues like the Green New Deal, and people responded, and they came out. So that would be my message. It creates jobs, and it provides justice for those who have always been historically exposed. So I agree with the professor 100%. It's all there for us. And it's not the fear of God that drives Republican politicians, by the way. It's the fear of voters. And we got a real chance here if we message to build that fear of voters into them, because we're going to defeat a lot of them this year. And then as they're on the Senate or House floor next year, they're going to be saying, do I feel lucky that I can survive 2022 with doing nothing on climate when I can see how many suburban voters, especially young people, responded in 2020.
Thank you, Senator. Professor, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. I'd also was thinking I'd ask you about the role of conservative media among other corporate interests and how sort of their platform and their messaging helps to amplify this sort of anti-science ethos that we see.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that, as the senator was saying, so many people are worried about this, even within the Republican Party. There are majorities of Republicans all across this country who are experiencing climate change and know that it's happening now. And especially for young people within the Republican Party, they're really worried about climate change, because it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. You want to have a livable planet. And if you're 20 years old and a Republican and you see your entire party not leading on this issue, not even taking it seriously, you see Donald Trump in the White House being a climate denier, that scares you because you know it's real. You can see it with your own eyes. So I think that this is going to become a big wedge issue, and the Republican Party is going to have to change its position on this issue going forward. In terms of your question about the media and how they cover this, it's not just conservative media. We can certainly point fingers to climate denial on places like Fox News. But unfortunately, even our mainstream sort of centrist outlets like ABC or CBS or CNN, when they run stories about something like the wildfires still playing out all across the West Coast, they do not even mention climate change. And we know from science that we have 500% more risk for wildfires across the Western United States. We have 500% more risk for heat waves across the Western United States because of climate change. Where I live right now in Santa Barbara, we're gearing up for yet another heat wave next week that's going to stress out our electricity system. All of the national forests around where I live are closed because of massive fire risk. There's such a dangerous situation that we're facing here. We've had 5 million acres burned this summer on the West Coast. That is a size of New Jersey in terms of the area that's burned. And yet, our TV news outlets don't even mention climate change in their coverage. Media Matters did a study of all the coverage of the fires in August, and just 5% of the TV news segments on places like ABC, CBS, CNN mentioned climate change. So that is not okay. That is a complete abdication of responsibility when it comes to our media. And to circle back to your earlier question about, Congress and public opinion. I actually did this interesting study where we asked chiefs of staff and legislative directors in Congress, both in the Senate and the House. We asked them, what do you think the public thinks about climate change? And we compared it to very high quality estimates of what the public actually thinks in their own districts. And what we found is a gap between what these legislative staff who help their members of Congress make decisions think the public thinks about climate change and what the public actually thinks about climate change. And what we show is that the more these offices are meeting with groups like the American Petroleum Institute, fossil fuel organizations, the more they are taking money from these organizations, the worse job they do at understanding and correctly perceiving public support for climate change. So we're lucky to have somebody like Senator Markey who understands the strong public support that's out there for climate action. But unfortunately, too few politicians and too few of their staff understand the public support. And particularly within the Democratic Party, there's been a real shying away from this issue, that you shouldn't talk about it like it's some kind of dirty little secret. Well, it's not. It's actually a very important issue for Democrats. In polls, including one recently, maybe last week, it was the #1 issue for Democrats. So we are not living in the 1980s anymore. We have to be talking about climate change in all our races. And we need our politicians and their staff to get with the program and understand the very strong support that exists, not just within the Democratic Party, not just within young people, but also within the Republican Party. That's the fact when it comes to support for climate change amongst the public.
Thank you. I know we're getting to the top of the hour here, so I just want to ask one more question.
Jay, if I may, I just want to follow up, if I could quickly, Jay, on what the professor just said, in terms of the disproportionate amount of money which goes from the fossil fuel industry into the Republican Party. There's an old saying that it's hard to understand something when you're paid not to understand it. And so since so much of their funding comes from the fossil fuel industry, they're paid not to understand it. They went to very fine universities. They had the same science courses that everyone else had in grammar school, in high school, in college. All of a sudden, they just can't understand climate science anymore because they're paid not to by the fossil fuel industry. That's what's been going on. And that's why this election is so important. You know, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I introduced the Green New Deal on February 7, 2019, we got killed on Fox News. We got killed in all the right-wing media. We got killed out of the White House. In fact, they had a more sustained message on it than our side did. They just killed us because, of course, they're dependent upon right-wing money all the way up and down the line. And they called the Green New Deal socialism. Look at it. Look Look what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey are doing with this socialistic proposal. And you know what we've been saying? And it's a powerful message. What do you call tax breaks for the oil, gas, and coal industry for 100 years? It's socialism. It's tipping ordinary families upside down and shaking money out of their pockets and handing it over to the wealthiest industries in America. Give us some of that socialism for wind and solar, all electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, for battery storage technologies, for energy efficiency technologies, and we will bury the fossil fuel industry in a generation while creating millions of new jobs. That has to be our message, and we have to call them out on the hypocrisy. We just can't back down. We got to lean in on this. These guys are complete hypocrites on this. And as we then say, well, let's just take away all the tax breaks for these companies. Oh, you can't do that. That interferes with capitalism. Well, give us some of that capitalism for the new technologies. And we'll live with the level playing field because we'll bury you because it's lower cost. It's easy to install. There have never been a wind meltdown or solar meltdown, like a nuclear power plant in the history of the world. So we're ready to have the debate, and we just have to lean in the next 5 weeks. And then after that, just take it to them and force these votes, and we will be successful. So that's my view. And 2 days ago, I actually led a letter to the Presidential Debate Commission. And back in 2016, there wasn't a single question asked of Hillary or Trump about the climate crisis. And for the first debate, the Presidential Commission has the list of all the questions and the subject areas. They haven't got climate in there. So I got 36 of my colleagues in the Senate to join with me to write a letter to the commission saying, just cut it out, will you? Let's just stop it. As the professor was just saying, amongst Democrats, this issue's now at the top of the list. Let's get it in there. We can win on it. And it should be a question or two or three in every one of the debates. We're going to win on this, but we have to force this system to respond. It's a disgrace that there is no climate question that's going to be asked in this first debate. We have to put it out there front and center. We'll win on it. We'll excite voters when they hear our message. So I just thank you, Jay, and I apologize. I just got a little bit energized by the professor's answer. Just wanted to play off of it.
Not at all. And I respect that energy that you're bringing here. The last thing I do want to ask is, you talk about we can win on climate change. Let's say that you do. Let's say that Vice President Biden, wins the White House in January. What will it take for a unified Democratic government, albeit probably one with slim margins, that won't be able to overcome a filibuster? What's it going to take for that caucus to pass comprehensive climate legislation? And what will that look like? If the Democrats take the government and you want to act on that popular mandate, what's the first thing that you want to pass to tell climate voters that you're hearing them and paying attention to their voices?
Well, first, we want to say we want to work with the Republicans. If Mitch McConnell is still the minority leader, which we're going to put him into the minority leader position, and he says, we don't want to work with you, then we'll have to change the filibuster rules. So we don't need 60 votes anymore. That's just the bottom line. We'll just have to change the rules. We can't let the planet burn to a crisp because they can use filibuster rules to stop us. So that's number one. And number two, we got a big IOU that's going to be out there, especially amongst younger voters. We're going to bring that IOU right out to the Senate and the House and just say, we want to cash this in. We want big policy changes. And we want them out of the White House. We want them out of the Congress. And it won't be in one area. One area is not enough. It has to be across the board. It has to be in the transportation sector, agricultural, industrial, commercial, housing sectors. We can make big changes. We need permanent tax breaks for wind and solar. They have permanent tax breaks for oil, gas, and coal. We have to make ours permanent too. And we have to extend it off to offshore wind too. We can create tens of thousands of jobs in offshore wind, but we need the same kind of tax breaks for purchasing more fuel efficient, hybrids and all electric vehicles. We can do it. We just have to, if necessary, change the rules if the Republicans are going to be obstinate, obdurate oppositionists And we'll just have to deal with it historically and make sure that we do it, but in a way in which we say to the American people, we're going to create millions of jobs doing this. We're going to have a green infrastructure bill, a couple of $1 trillion, and we're going to make sure it's green the whole way. And we're going to put a couple of million people to work just in that green infrastructure bill. So it should not be one thing. It should be across the board, and it should also be kind of actions which the executive branch can take. So I thank you for having me on. Much appreciated. Great honor to be joining you today. And thank you, Professor, for all of your phenomenal work. Just historically good analysis of the situation that we're in. So thank you, Jay, so much for having me on.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you, Senator Markey, for joining me today. And again, I'd love to have you on to talk a little bit longer about the Supreme Court sometimes, because I don't think we're going to be talking any less about it anytime soon. And also thank you to Professor Stokes for joining us today, and to our viewers at home. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more news and shows like this one. If you do it, I will write you a personal thank you note. That is a promise. Again, thanks to our viewers, and have a great